As the founder of the Current and Strategic Affairs Forum, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you and our distinguished panelists to the 15th CASA webinar. The subject for today is the geopolitical impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on India. As a pandemic leaves in its wake a trail of death and destruction, loss of livelihoods, and so much more, we have with us this eminent panel to share their views on the geopolitical impact of the pandemic. Our first speaker for the day is Lieutenant General Syed Hasnain, PVSM, UYSM, AVSM, SM, and VSM bar. General Hasnain, as most of us know, is a former General Officer commanding 15 Corps at Srinagar, 21 Corps, and the Military Secretary. He has served from Sri Lanka to the Siachen Glacier, from the Northeast to Jammu and Kashmir, where he has had 7 tenures, and in UN operations from Mozambique to Rwanda. He's seen it all in all these crucial appointments. Today, he's a much sought after speaker and writes for major Indian newspapers, besides being a regular participant in television debates on mainstream television. He's a graduate of the Defence Services Staff College, the Army War College, and the Royal College of Defence Studies, King's College London, and the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Hawaii. He's associated with a number of think tanks and contributes in a very major way in the strategic discourse of the country at various military, civil services, and corporate institutions. He has lectured in many international institutions too. He is also the Chancellor of the Central University of Kashmir since 2018, a member of the National Disaster Management Authority since February 2020 in the status of the Secretary to the Government of India, and is also a member of the Empowered Committee for Information and Communication set up by the PMO. Second speaker today is Mr. Gautam Mukhopadhaya IFS, who is a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research since June 19. He has had a long and distinguished career in the Indian Foreign Service, during which he has served in various capacities in Indian embassies and missions and in the United Nations. He was India's ambassador to Syria, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. He is an alumnus of the Delhi University and the National Defence College. Mr. Mukhopadhyaya's current areas of interest include Afghanistan, Myanmar, India's Act East policy, and regional cooperation involving South and Southeast Asia. He was a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace at Washington, D.C. His other current affiliations include an association with Niti Aayog's Niti Forum on the Northeast, an advisor, a chair on the CII Task Force on Economic Ties with Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. We look forward to hearing his views on the impact of this pandemic raging in India, not only in our neighborhood, but around the globe. We welcome you, Mr. Mukhopadhyaya, to this webinar. Our third panelist is none other than Lieutenant General Dr. Prakash Menon, PVSM, AVSM, VSM retired. General Menon is the director of the Strategic Studies Program in the Takshashila Institution. He is also Professor Emeritus at the Transdisciplinary University, Bangalore, and an adjunct professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. Commissioned in 1972, General Menon has had extensive operational experience in commanding counterinsurgency operations in Central, North, and South Kashmir. He was also Commandant of the National Defence College, New Delhi. After his retirement in 2011, he continued in the government as military advisor and secretary to the Government of India from 2015 as officer in special duty in the National Security Council Secretariat. He has a PhD from Madras University for his thesis, Limited War and Nuclear Deterrence in the Indo-Pak Context, and has authored a book, The Strategy Trap, India and Pakistan Under the Nuclear Shadow. Post-retirement, he continues to teach and research with a special focus on the role of force in statecraft. Welcome, sir, to this webinar. I now hand over to our moderator for the evening, Mr. Manoj Mohanka. Over to you, Manoj.
Thank you, Gautam. Welcome, friends. India has been successful in saving so many lives. We saved the entire humanity from a big tragedy. India launched the world's biggest vaccination program. We fulfilled our responsibility towards the global community by sending vaccines and training people. India's success will help the entire world. This quote was from our Prime Minister to the World Economic Forum on the 28th of January this year. Some other things that I'd like to bring into focus to set the context of our discussion this evening. No meeting of the National Executive Council of the NDMA was apparently held between November and March. March 3rd week, the National Institute of Virology was pointing to a new strain in Maharashtra. By 4th April, India had exceeded the daily case peak load previously in September. The March 2020 national lockdown, having had a damaging political and economic fallout, this option was perhaps not on the table, what with elections and the Kumbh Mela on the anvil. And adding to all of this was the farmers' agitation, which had been continuing on the borders of Delhi for several long months. The last peak was 1 million active cases. We have already hit 3.67 million, and the peak somewhere indeterminate. The tsunami has hit us and hit us hard. Daily deaths have horrendous numbers, and what's worse is that many lives that could have been saved have not been for lack of medical amenities, whether it be oxygen or ICU beds. We now have had the sorry situation of bodies floating in the Ganges or being buried or cremated on the sides. And it saddens that something which we used to regard as, or say, Ganga Tera Pani Amrit, has probably now changed to Ram Teri Ganga Meli. How did we go downhill from being Vishwa Guru and the world's pharmacy to this situation in 2 months? Are we right to be tetchy about Rihanna and Greta Thunberg? Happy when our PM is on the cover of international magazines, but very, very unhappy when he is criticized by the New York Times, Washington Post, or Australia Times. Switching tracks, we are not part of BRI by choice, but then we aren't part of RCEP, not Trans-Pacific partnerships, and these trade blocs are developing. Are we reaching splendid isolation the way Japan did a few centuries ago? China has wooed all our neighbors. We have not really been able to stand by Bhutan. Bangladesh has been threatened openly about joining the Quad. Nepal's present dispensation is pro-China. Sri Lanka is in Chinese debt, and the less said about Pakistan, the better. China has now taken the lead on vaccine diplomacy, even as we renege on global supplies. Are we unfortunately a failed state, as India today asked on its May 7th? What geopolitical, geostrategic impact does this pandemic in India have on India? That's the question all of us are going to get an insight into with our three extremely eminent panelists, and who better than General Hasnain to set the ball rolling, given his deep insight since he serves on the apex body of the National Disaster Management. Over to you, General Hasnain.
Thank you. Good evening. Manoj bhai, thank you very much. Jai Hind to everyone, all our viewers, and thank you for having me on this very, very important panel. I'm actually really honored to be a part of it. After a long time, I've actually prepared a talk. I usually speak from a couple of bullet points or maybe from a transparency, but this time I've actually created a script because I don't want to miss out anything. I think it's just too important to convey what one wants to convey at this stage. So I'll get into it straight away, the geopolitical impact of COVID-19 in India. And I start with what I consider as what is a comprehensive national power. We all are so aware of it. Most of us have dealt with this almost all our careers. Geopolitics is mostly dictated by comprehensive national power, and that is dictated by the geostrategic location of a country, raw military power, economic capability, presence of crucial resources such as oil and minerals, high scientific capability, education, research and development. Very importantly, the ability to stave off internal crises, the way Manoj Saab was just talking about. The propensity for stability, stabilizing in a crisis. unity and singularity of purpose, it also projects soft power and is handling, including information and image projection of a nation. Give or take a few of these other things into this, and this is actually what comprehensive national power is all about. So what is perceived to have happened to India in the month of April, May 2021, and a year prior to that during the period of the pandemic? What has been the impact on the international image of the country and its ability to pursue geopolitics and respond to geopolitics? India, I think, handled the first phase rather well. A quick decision on lockdown, scientific approach to the whole problem, quickly into vaccine development, opening up after the first wave, economic ramp up, no reputational dilution, perhaps except the migrant crisis, which we overcame subsequently. Coming to the second wave, it took India by surprise, the health system being perceived archaic, insufficient investment in the gap period between the first and the second wave, lost some reputation due to inefficient handling, international imagery of low oxygen availability all over the country, a ban on flights from India, funeral pyres burning all over. So the opening of India to foreign assistance after 17 years, not a very positive image. So has all this created a dent on India's comprehensive national power, that which is the aspect which enables a country to play its geopolitics, so participate in geopolitics and have the impact of geopolitics. I would say the economic domain adversely perhaps got impacted. If you recall India's transition in 1991 from a begging bowl, a nation with a begging bowl, to an international contributor, it helped shape our geopolitics and the ability to sit on the high table. We can't afford to fall from that grace, the grace of being a contributor. That is why the recovery has to be quick and has to be seen to be very quick, energetic, and with a sense of commitment. Remember, India continues to remain a country which aspires to be a part of the UN Security Council. The impression from the images which are going around the world is about a rush to help India, not because India is so important, but because it is so helpless. Now that is damaging to the image, overall image, and I'm going to talk a lot about image as we go along. Domestic political contestation is getting churned up in India, and hopefully political stability will not get affected. The election obsession, the next set of elections is sometime in the month of February, March next year. We've got almost a 8, 9, 10 month period. So we've got enough time to be able to, without political churning, to be able to recover ground. The claim to regional primacy and leadership, that has expectedly taken a fair hit. There has been a quickened demise of Indian primacy in the regional sphere in the neighborhood. The ability to influence and materially help the neighborhood will shrink definitely. Thus, some strategic space, as already spoken by Manoj sir, will be yielded to China. Recovery of the space is imperative. Bandwagoning of many of the South Asian states with China has already commenced, as also mentioned earlier. 27th of April, we had the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi hosting a video conference with counterparts from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, where he proposed a number of measures to promote anti-pandemic cooperation among them, as well as to promote economic recovery to get on with the Belt and Road cooperation. Incidentally, India was also invited to this session, but chose not to attend. Regional health multilateralism to promote mutual assistance and joint action on health emergencies, such as the one which is going on, is becoming therefore an imperative. Either we do it quickly or China will do it and will then be difficult to replace. Must be seen to be helping. As we get helped ourselves internationally by other countries, we must be seen to be helping locally, regionally. The ability to be a leading power rather than just a balancing power in the matrix of future geopolitics is what is India's ambition. It will be challenging to maintain that in the light of the compromising, I won't say yet compromised, but compromising status. And it's important for us to be conscious of it and not be in self-denial that the process of compromise of image is on. The question is, will strategically important players view India with the negativism and question its capability to play an effective role in future groupings? Perhaps it may not come down to anything as bad as that. with all the assistance from the United States in particular, will it impact India's policy of maintaining its strategic autonomy? That is a big question. I've spoken a lot of negatives. Let me come to some positives. Time is a great healer, as also context. In 1989, India was weak and taken for granted. At the end of the Cold War, if you remember, we had $1 billion left in our foreign exchange reserves. In 2 years, by 1991, given the right course correction in economics and willingness to change direction, India became the cause for cheer. It took time, but time is something which is not on our hands at the moment, and that's something we have to be aware of. India's geostrategic location. We continue talking about the importance of Pakistan's geostrategic location, you know, the crossroads of civilizations, etc. But we always, because of that, keep our own geostrategic location, I think, in a relatively lower place of importance. I think what we need to remember is our own geostrategic location is of immense importance as keeper of the international waterways, as the region which is bordering the new Great Game, the region of the new Great Game, the proximity to Afghanistan, the presence of the Andaman Islands, right there, the dividing line between the Indo and the Pacific, right? We must continue to leverage all this to our advantage, including the presence of a strong diaspora in the United States, in Australia, in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Muscat and Oman, all over the Middle East. A major geostrategic and geopolitical advantage rarely realized is that India occupies a strategic space to deny the eastward march of political Islam. From the Atlantic to Pakistan and to the northern tip of Central Asia, Islam rules the roost. It's yet in a churn and could affect the course of future history. India is a bulwark of reason and moderation available to contain this, and must be seen to be a bulwark of reason and moderation, with the mass of Indian Muslims, the second largest Muslim community in the world. A look at SARC. Consider this as an opportunity to reconfigure SARC, adding health and environment as the main concerns of the moment, for the moment, issues which are really not under major consideration. With Pakistan's nuisance value largely neutralized, take positive control for the sake of our other neighbors. Take control of SARC for the sake of our other neighbors. Use BIMSTEC as the alternative to ensure regional influence through outreach. Don't let the image set in of a helpless India. That is the worst thing to do in a case where there is a degree of negativism in the environment. Don't allow this image to set in. Medical diplomacy will help overcome much of the loss of diplomatic leverage. The field of disaster management, something which I'm intensely involved in today, the field of disaster management and humanitarian relief, HADR as it's called, ensures that Indian presence can be felt everywhere, in search and rescue, in scientific research, in early warning, in every aspect which can happen, and in an area which is very, very prone to disaster. I'll talk a little about image and perception. Social media, electronic and print media are all proving negative for India internationally. Western media's negativity stems from the traditional perception of a backward India stuck in the groove of the socialist period. It draws a malicious pleasure out of it. Our confrontationist attitude instead of professional perception building has cost us dear today, and we are paying for it. Western media is gleefully therefore showing the negative India to the world. Why are we being defensive? For example, why are we being defensive on vaccine exports? It was one of the ways of retaining image we have carefully cultivated among less developed and even better off countries. Agreeably, it created an artificial shortage within India, which should have been made up through more licenses to manufacture. But the export decision was not a wrong decision. Let us build on this perception that India was not selfish. It was willing to share, but suffered in the bargain, and we will do it yet again. The coronavirus story over the past 12 months has been successfully used by China to create a more positive image of itself in a number of countries. It has succeeded in establishing its relationship, making it stronger with Europe and much of Africa. Like it or not, what international media is gleefully projecting is dilution of democracy in India, divisive politics, and backsteps from the secular nature of the country. When we get the next quarterly economic results, and these are real, transparent, and low, the image will be over. This is not allowed the next seen and catered for. Big ticket media agencies need to be approached, and the budget of any ministry which needs a quantum jump at this time is the Information and Broadcasting Ministry. It could take in a couple of high quality consultants because these campaigns need professional management. Perhaps a foray into Africa needs to be made at this stage, at least catering to potential of a big wave coming in Africa and creating the facilities to be able to advise and do something with the experience of 2 waves behind us. Bounce back as an image enhancer. The whole concept of bounce back. When a negative image of capability is created, and the same has a cascading effect on international perception, that image just sticks. The vaccination drive, for example, could prove to be an image enhancer. A revolutionary method by throwing caution to the winds, get the uniformed forces to take this on under a military vaccination authority, for example. The Uyghur example of China and how it creates no waves in the world is an example of focusing on the positive rather than allowing the negative to create the narratives. Specific to Pakistan, US, and China, the last part of my intervention, assistance to Pakistan. This is going to be a very, very debatable issue. We could discuss this here in this panel, in the discussion today. However, it will be a huge image enhancer if it does take place at all. A thorough focus on Jammu and Kashmir to limit the waves and the effects of the remaining waves, bring home clearly the amount of attention that India is paying to human security. War game contingencies of any big event which may take place in Kashmir in the near future. With the United States, express gratitude, but continue retaining strategic autonomy. In all meetings, remain professional. Admission of gratitude need not compromise our image. Don't show a sudden propensity towards greater strategic cooperation. Go at the same pace that we were going earlier. Also, it need not be assumed that the US is interested in confrontation with China, even with the denting of its economy and the coming of Joe Biden. Much of what nations say they do not usually do. So let's not go faster than the US itself on as far as the Indo-Pacific containment is concerned. China is making every effort to dampen India's international image. We have focused primarily on many aspects of war fighting with China. The perception game, which is his strength, needs to be countered strongly. It needs good perception managers internationally and budgets along with that. The possibility of China exploiting India's sudden weakening image, financial down, etc., to coerce us once again on the borders cannot be ruled out. Last year's actions by the Indian Armed Forces were excellent in messaging China. We will need a bold approach to continue projecting our will and capability to thwart aggression on our borders. No rhetoric is required. Simply no rhetoric is required. It has to be nuanced and with a plan, including a media and information plan. The return of normality in China is important. This is something that has so far eluded US and India, the return of normality. This will have an impact on, I'll have 2 minutes more, impact on geopolitical dynamics, especially the revised Indo-Pacific strategy of the Quad nations. I'll say that again, this will have an impact on the geopolitical dynamics, especially the revised Indo-Pacific strategy of the Quad nations. Remember, China is of great importance also to Australia, also to Japan. It is not for nothing that Quad did not automatically arise as an overnight concept. It's been thoroughly analyzed at every stage since 2007. Lastly, there is one area where we have made a mark in the last few years, the Middle East. It has stood us in very good stead. We should be careful about our stance in the current Israel-Palestinian standoff. I foresee, notice something, how Imran Khan and Prime Minister Imran Khan and General Bajwa, the combine is playing out its new game in Saudi Arabia at this moment. I foresee some changes in the Arab stance if this conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, goes a level beyond. And the Biden administration is not going to back Prime Minister Netanyahu as Trump did. Let us not be therefore on the wrong side at this crucial juncture. At this time, study it thoroughly before we take on any decisions. Given the intensity of the current wave of the pandemic, it will be a while before the government can focus on external diplomacy. The intellectual diplomacy must continue through think tanks and media efforts. A void cannot be allowed. Earliest bounce back diplomacy must be on the rails in the very near future. I think I'll stop at this stage. I hope I'm within my time. Thank you very much, and Jai.
Yeah. Thank you, General Hasnain. You've covered a wide repertoire of subjects in your inimitable style with deep thinking, and we'll come back to you with several questions later. But I think the underlying message that one gets is if we are to retain our strategic autonomy, we can't appear to be helpless. I think those are the takeaway words from your talk that have resonated very, very strongly. And you know, the pandemic has overtaken all of us in India. There is hardly a family that's not impacted. That degree of separation which existed in the previous wave, I don't think there's any degree of separation even amongst all of us who are on this seminar today. It's hit us very, very close home. And who better than Ambassador Mukhopadhaya to explain how this augurs for us on the global arena. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me first thank CASA for this invitation, General Murthy for his very kind introduction, and Mr. Mohanka for your excellent introduction to the themes of today's topic. Let me say it's a particular pleasure to be in a panel with the two distinguished and celebrated generals. Something that was perhaps missed out in my introduction bio was that I'm perhaps one of the few Foreign Service officers who has spent 4 years literally in the company of the Indian Armed Forces, 1 year as part of the 41st National Defense College course, and 3 years in the Ministry of Defense as JSPIC. But perhaps my closest association really is when we reopened our embassy in Kabul after the ouster of the Taliban in November 2001, when I was part of an IL-76 mission commanded by another Air Marshal Menon, that reopened the embassy, and the next 5 months were really spent in the company of a military medical team, you know, really beginning our return to Afghanistan post-Taliban. So with that sort of little 1 minute wasted, I would say on introductions, let me get to the topic. I think, you know, the theme of the seminar is, I'm not quite sure, global impact of the pandemic in India or on India, because I've seen both those phrases used. So pardon me if I slip, you know, it's very difficult.
No, these are fungible.
Am I clear?
Yeah, you're clear. This
right,
is,
exactly. So
this is fungible. So please feel free to weave one into the other.
So my talk is going to be similarly fungible. I'm going to be drifting and navigating between both those themes. But let me just start by saying, just about a year back, you know, we were not discussing the international impact of the pandemic in India. We were actually discussing to a much greater extent the great global concern of that time, which was being called the Wuhan virus, the virus coming out of China and its impact on the world and secondarily on India. Many in India were indignant that it should be called the Wuhan virus to stigmatize China and its patent irresponsibility in the spread of the virus. Many wanted China censured in the WHO. It was even speculated that it might be part of some biological warfare. Since there have been theories suggesting that it was part of collaborative gain-of-function research, partially funded by the United States, by the US. And that theory seems to have gained a little more credence recently. But today, the virus has mutated several times in different parts of the world, not in a lab or an animal market, but amidst populations. What is called the Indian variant, particularly one strain of it, B1.617.2, has been declared by the WHO as a variant of concern. It has been found in 44 countries at last count. Most countries have barred travelers from India. Scheduled VIP visits have been postponed, deferred, or turned virtual. Australia has barred its own nationals from returning from India at the risk of legal penalties. The UK is reviewing its vaccine rollout to prevent the B1.617.2 virus mutant. It has decreased the spacing of its second dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine to 6 to 8 weeks while India has actually increased it from 6 to 8 weeks to 12 to 16. These have been the most direct impacts globally of the pandemic in India as a health issue. I could speak a little but General Ata Hasnain has already spoken about the impact of the virus when it first came out in January 2020, but he's largely covered the ground. I would just like to sort of differ on 1 or 2 points. One is that I think there is a case that perhaps our action was a little delayed, though some time would have to be taken to evaluate the effect of the virus. Perhaps there is a doubt in some quarters, and there is suspicions that we wasted too much time on trying to suppress the anti-CA agitation, on engineering riots in Eastern Delhi, on the Trump spectacle, and perhaps even the elections in Madhya Pradesh, before we actually imposed a literally draconian 4-hour lockdown. Its impact and that lockdown, whether it was well thought out and premeditated, and preemptive actions could have been taken. I think that's something that was entirely missing. And the second is that I think while the response to the first wave of the virus, the lockdown, was on the whole quite good. Systems were put in place. In many places, they worked very well. Really, there are big questions to ask about the aftermath of the first wave, and whether or not we completely lowered our guard between the first wave and the second wave. Time that we should have actually used to create redundancies in case it was not needed, but actually to create capacities if it was. And certainly ramping up production, ramping up testing. There was a lot of talk about Atmanirbharta, production-linked incentives, resilient supply chains, shorter supply chains, reducing dependence on APIs from China, and so on. But in actual fact, when the second wave has hit, we have back to square one. We are looking to the United States for the raw materials. We're looking to China for APIs. And if China raises its prices, we are affected. I'm not so sure we've made any great impact. But let me now turn to the external aspect of it. Let me also acknowledge some good things that the government did. First, I think it conducted massive air and sea operations to bring back stranded Indians. Second, it supplied drugs wherever it was and whenever it was needed, although there were some contretemps, particularly vis-a-vis the US. Prime Minister took the initiative vis-a-vis SARC. I think that was a statesmanly-like initiative, but I think it went adrift and wasn't really followed up. Prime Minister himself spoke on a daily basis with world leaders on pandemic cooperation. And I would, like General Atta, also defend and justify some degree of cooperation to meet international obligations as the pharma of the world and to help our neighbors and other poor countries. But in spite of all this, the question that remains is whether what we did was sufficient, and whether that period, the 9 months that we had from May to, the year that we had from March to February, could not have been used to do different things. Should we not also have been thinking about how we could use the lockdown to anticipate a return of the pandemic once controls were relaxed, once migrants started returning back to their villages and then coming back to the towns, as the economy returned to its wheels? I've already talked about ramping up APIs, but it could also apply to oxygen, life-saving drugs, augment hospital capacities and vaccine capabilities. We took steps on vaccine, but we did not take the steps on the scale that were required. Everybody knows what the population of India is and how much of it would require to be populated. We talked about vaccine development with the United States.
Is Ambassador Mukhopadhaya frozen, or is it only on my screen?
No, he has frozen. I think his link.
Yeah, I think it's frozen.
General Menon, do you want to call him?
Gone off.
General Mukhi, you're muted.
Time to.
Yeah, I think his link is broken. Manoj, I think we could shift to General Menon and then.
General Menon, sir, could you just call him? He's frozen. I don't have his number.
Screen is frozen. General Menon is going to stitch up.
Just a minute.
Hello, am I back?
Yes, you're back
Great,
now.
okay.
We missed you.
Okay, I'm sorry.
we-
I think there was an unstable, Wi-Fi connection. I've switched on to hotspot.
Not to worry.
We just lost your last 60 seconds, sir. Go ahead.
Last 60 seconds. All right. So essentially, I was talking about whether we should not have used that time to actually raise the TRIPS issues, that we are raising now in the process of vaccine development, so that the vaccine would have developed, in a different TRIPS environment entirely. And while we are looking at the US, and that's fine, it's the most advanced country in terms of scientific research, epidemiological profiles suggest that the impact of the pandemic in India and Southeast Asia were much closer together. So should we really not have thought of collaborative ventures with other countries with similar profiles? Should we not also have thought, I think something very fundamental that was actually pointed out by Arundhati Roy amongst others, rethink our relationship with nature and predatory development. In an essay, Arundhati Roy had talked about the pandemic as a portal to a new future. We completely missed that part. What we saw instead, and I have to be frank about this, was an attempt to deal with the pandemic on cheap, not invest the budget that was allocated in areas where it was required, but in symbolic gestures like pot banging and lighting lamps, in an international projection of India that was far ahead of reality, and lowering of our guard after the first wave. But we are not here only to discuss our failures and its health impact. Although the impact of the pandemic will be widespread, I will confine myself a little more now to its geopolitical aspects, which I think is what you must be most interested in. I hope I'm keeping to time. See, one thing about the pandemic is that its impact is not going to be felt immediately or directly. If we look at pandemics in the past, they have taken a long time to unfold. Casey Singh, in a talk the other day, actually talked about the impact of the bubonic plague in Europe in world history. The scale of deaths in the bubonic plague, in fact, created a mobility in the labor market, which loosened European feudalism and created the way for the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution. Similarly, he took the example of yellow fever in Haiti. Napoleon sent a contingent of troops to Haiti to crush down the yellow fever there. That contingent actually perished because they were simply not, immune to the yellow fever the way the Haitians were. And as a result of that, Napoleon surrendered, in fact, ceded the rest of their French occupations to the United States, which opened the way to the West Coast and the gold rush and everything that followed in the development of the United States after that. But let me also share some examples from India. In the 19th century, in 1877-88, and Shruti Kapila has written about this, there was a major famine in India, the Deccan famine. The Deccan famine, in fact, opened up the way for the sedition laws that still are in operation all over colonial South Asia. Most recently, it's been applied in Myanmar liberally. But it also paved the way for the Indian National Congress. So it had a political impact. But perhaps more significant was the Bombay plague of 1995-96. There were fewer deaths, but it was much more visible. It had a stronger impact. It, in fact, was a turning point in the struggle against the British. It became the launching pad for the mass politics of Tilak. In contrast, the Spanish flu of 1917-18, which saw much greater casualties than either, did not seem to have much impact and was practically forgotten in India until very recently. But who can say that the timing of Gandhiji's return from South Africa and the success of his politics, starting with the indigo plantations in Champaran, may not have had something to do with the Spanish flu? The 1942 famine, on the other hand, occurred at the fag end of the British Empire under a world war and marked its death knell. It was a foregone conclusion, but it erased any legitimacy of the British Empire that was left. Of course, the pandemics also take place in the context of certain geopolitical trends. And the pandemic has certainly crystallized, sharpened, and perhaps even hardened some of the trends since the end of the Cold War. Broadly defined, these trends have been a move from a bipolar world to a briefly unipolar world to a multipolar world. But I differ slightly in that thing. Although multipolar world makes us feel good and part of the many poles, the reality is that it's a tricentric world dominated by a rising China, a United States about which there are question marks and doubts, and a revanchist Russia. But it's tricentric in two ways. First, it is, of course, tripolar, but it's also tricentric in the sense of its selfish and self-centered powers. This is the era of America first, my country first, nation first. It's a Hobbesian formula, and I'm not sure a very good formula for international relations. Middle powers may exercise a lot of influence in their own regions, but to play a larger role, they have to align with one or the other, or one or more of these three powers.
So
but let's look at some more. 2 more minutes. Let's look at some more concrete impacts. One was, of course, the Trump defeat in the January 2021 elections. With it, the US is back to a more conventional and predictable path. Some trends will continue. With China, the geopolitical and strategic competition continues, now threatening Taiwan. Afghanistan, again, continuity with Trump policy, but with the withdrawal, it has signaled new priorities: China, wider counterterrorism efforts, and the pandemic. China has dropped its pretense of a peaceful rise and come out on top of the pandemic, but has emerged as an opportunistic, sullen, and aggressive power, what Shyam Saran described somewhere as a mixture of hubris and insecurity, showing its teeth in the South China Sea, Ladakh, and now Taiwan. The response has been an elevated Quad, foreign ministerial and summit meetings, nervousness in the ASEAN about its loss of centrality. Russia, US-Russia frictions have sharpened. Ukraine is the most obvious, but of relevance to us, Russia may have also played its Indo-Pacific card against the Quad in Myanmar. We might well have in the Quad the makings of a new Cold War. You have European powers, UK, France, Germany also taking an interest in the Indo-Pacific. The West looks upon us, has come out to help us. There's been a lot of negative reporting, but behind that negative reporting, let us not forget that the West wants to help India, not least because it wants to promote India as a bulwark against China. And what we see in terms of the UK-India Free Trade Agreement, the EU-India Comprehensive Trade and Investment Negotiations are all part of this. And on the other hand, we also see competition in vaccine diplomacy. Russia, US, and China have now taken off and in fact left our efforts in the dust. The international image today of India is not 60 million doses of vaccine, but funeral pyres, cremation grounds, floating bodies, people gasping for breath in car parks. So unfortunately, I do feel that the pandemic has left India somewhat unmasked, weak. General Atta is absolutely right in identifying it as a diminishment of India as a regional power. But again, like him, I believe in time as a great healer. India can pull up its socks and regain its natural place in the world order. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, or should I have said Ambassador General Mukhopadhaya, given your stint with the MOD. Thank you for that excellent exposition.
I would be honored and flattered, but unfortunately, I cannot. I do not deserve it.
So really, I think we'll go back in the Q&A on your on the tricentric word that you used in terms of the shape of the world, and also bulwark against China. I think those two themes we'll go back during the Q&A. It's my pleasure now to request General Prakash Menon for his views. General Menon, please.
Thank you, Manoj, and good evening, everybody. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm going to speak to you on, I thought the topic was, what is the geopolitical effect on India? And that's what I'm going to actually address. But since it doesn't make a difference, I suppose I can say what I want. Let me start with the fact that when we do the assessment, we need to see as to how this is going to impact India's quest for development in terms of pulling people out of poverty, illiteracy, ill health, while protecting our values and our interests, and of course, that includes territorial interests. I think that's the framework in which we need to actually answer this question. But before I do that, let me just want to actually make a small clarification in terms of the idea of comprehensive national power, which is actually a Chinese construct meant to actually frighten the gullible because you might be the most powerful nation in the world. I mean, they might be 10 times more powerful than us. The question really means, in terms of power application, can that power be applied all together at one place or on one person? So relative power matters. CNP is meant to frighten. It's good for deterrence. But relative power is finally what matters as far as application of power is concerned. And I think we need to keep this in mind while we look at ourselves and look at the world. Second is this issue about image and so on. I am of the view that we need not bother so much about our image as much as we need to now see how do we get our act together to see as to how we can address what is still an ongoing crisis, and we do not know how many waves there are going to be. But the fact that we need to get our act together, I don't think is under any sort of, you can argue about it. And we might have opinions of how the government has dealt, but the fact remains we need to do more. One of the things which is obvious to me is that we cannot possibly, I mean, we can't do it immediately, carry on with the same administrative structure, framework, and the populace which is actually running it. Because it's like an old vehicle of a 1950 model trying to actually run a race into 2020. Unless we change that fundamentals of how India is administered, unless we address that issue, we can do what we want, but it will be ineffective because we have not addressed the real causes. Because what this pandemic has exposed is the inability to actually respond to a crisis in a manner that it should have been. Of course, most of it is wisdom in hindsight, but there are some certain obvious ones. And I would say even the vaccination. I mean, it was all a case of mathematical calculation. Diplomacy would have gained us something, but now let me tell you, all those countries we have promised vaccines to will not have a good opinion about India, because one of the things in my experience, man, that's quite old, 10 years ago, wherever I went, the Commandant NDCs, I mean, I was often told, especially in the neighborhood, hey, you guys promise a lot, you never deliver. And we must say that we have actually faltered on that account. So what does it mean for us? So one thing is internally, we got to sort out our administration. Secondly is, I mean, this is a long-term thing. Unless we resolve the issue of how we elect our political leaders, unless we reform the electoral system, and there is enough recommendations of various committees, constitution committees, and so on, because the quality of our leaders is today, what we see is inadequate to manage the challenges of India, which is very complex, no doubt. Any politician will be challenged. But the fact is, we are now electing politicians who don't deserve to be in power. We have to accept this. And this is a matter of electoral reform. And electoral reform has been on the plate, but we know politicians will not do it. Probably the only way out is actually the legal route, and maybe that will work. But let me just get to my substantial point, which I think, because a lot of things have already been covered by both my colleagues. And that's about the fact that India, whatever, we simply do not know what effect and the scope of the effect of the second wave, third and fourth wave and so on. What we know is that India's economy is going to take a severe beating. All our plans and all our budgets and all are going to go for a 6. The question is, how soon, how quick can we come back? How do we actually now use the opportunities which the pandemic has given us? And actually, you might find it very, I find it very difficult to say it, but the fact is that deaths in India, really speaking, does not have a strategic toll in the sense that we can afford to lose lives. Nobody likes to hear this, but that's a fact. Therefore, the number of deaths is not going to determine how India is going to come out of this pandemic. It will do so at the political level, because everybody is obviously affected personally. It will do so at the socio-political level, because that's going to actually change. And it will also do so at the socio-economic level. But socio-economic level is still dependent upon how India's leadership handles the economy. And that is why India can't do it in themselves. India needs the rest of the world. And that's a question which actually we need to now see as to how we're going to do it. Take the instance of the Chinese offering us actually assistance and so on. I think we just simply ignored them. The fact remains, we should do anything today to save lives as long as we don't create a long-term dependency. We should not sit on our geopolitical ego and say we won't take from China when China is offering us something which can save lives here. I don't see any sense in it, as long as there's no dependency made. And the fact remains that as far as China and Pakistan are concerned, what I see, and I actually just came to my mind while I was writing a paper on this, that what we're going to witness going forward is both China and Pakistan are going to adopt a strategy of 1,000 cuts. Let me explain this. They're going to do the small things to India to keep its resources pinned down to the subcontinent, its political, economic energy to the landmass. And the only thing they're worried about, the Chinese, as far as India is concerned, is the fact that we have this gift of geography of Peninsula India as a sword in the Indian Ocean. I know many of my naval friends would say that, this only comes when you have a big fight. I'm afraid that I don't completely agree with it at all. I'll tell you why. 1,000 cuts is now going to be, sometimes it will be cyber, sometimes it will be denial for some loan because of some international body, all sort of statecraft means which they will use. It will be little by little. And why are they doing it? Because they don't want us to be a maritime power. They are only interested about India's role in the context of what they're trying to do with the United States and the West. And unless we understand this strategy of ours, we will be playing into them. And the only way we can do it is that we need all the friends. We know China doesn't have to be a friend, but India has got certain amount of, let's say, market size and so on, which will also China has to consider. But the fact remains that we know what China's designs are. We wean ourselves away as early as possible, and that's going to take time, by the way, from any dependency on China. That is what this strategy should be. And the fact remains that this 1,000 cuts can be by many means. Some things which we will probably, it will be a small distraction, takes away energy, takes away our resources, and that's what it is. Weaken India slowly. They've been doing that for such a long time. We are the ones who actually refuse to see the writing on the wall. And whatever measures we took obviously are inadequate, because firstly, we make plans in strategic terms to do things where we can't afford. So now, with the economy really going to take a beating, if defense planners especially have to do a major thinking. So let me come down to what my other point is. How do we actually, we don't know simply how much the economy, we only know it's going to be affected. We know it's going to make a political, socio-political, socio-economic impact on India, different. India is too complex. We can't make a general statement, but the fact remains India's internal geopolitics will go through a period of stress and strain. And that is going to weaken us internally because it might affect our internal unity. A country already slammed by a pandemic with deepened internal unity is really going to be a challenge. And that requires leadership. Now, I'm not saying that leadership is not there, but they don't seem to be getting there. Without that, it's not possible to do it. We require leaders who not only at the center level, but at the state level. I'm so glad to hear the finance minister of Tamil Nadu. If you see his credentials, that's the sort of guy we need for the job. His credentials are really wonderful to see. And everybody has a very good opinion that this guy will deliver because he knows, he's an expert. He's not a full-time politician. He is a politician also, but he's got the expertise. India needs leaders with both. They must have political skills, but they must also have a knowledge of what the damn subject is about. And that, I think, is something which we have to do. So the point is, we want to now come out of the well that we are slowly in. We need a strategy. I'm not saying this strategy, and I quite understand why the strategy has not come out till now, because there are too many moving goalposts for the last year and a half. Quite understood. We need not have a strategy in the public space, but we need to have a national strategy which will, and it must be a multidisciplinary group. It cannot be just given to a couple of secretaries who don't have the time in the world to look at any sort of strategy. It has to be sort of housed in the National Security Council Secretariat, be multidisciplinary, and it can be anybody who actually the government wants, and come out with something, because things are changed. We can't say that it's going to be the same. It's not really changing. We must be able to identify the opportunities that the pandemic is going to create for us. After all, we have got this large mass of young people wanting to do so many things. It's a question of harnessing it, directing it, and getting it done. The question is, can we use the resources that we have in the better way? The fact that we have not used it so well, I think, is obvious.
Sir, 2 minutes
We
from
can
my
do
end.
better. And I would agree that this country is not easy to govern, but the pandemic has exposed certain weaknesses, especially in the administrative setup. Just look at the type of instructions that they give. I mean, the staff work it has, they keep changing everything and keep, I mean, some of these things which come out from the center are really, I mean, India goes with South Africa to the United Nations and talks about trips. Have you read what Mr. Tushar Mehta told the Supreme Court the other day? He seemed to be saying something else. So one part of the government doesn't seem to know what the other part is doing. So obviously we got to get our act together. So first internal, and there is no way but to increase our connections to the rest of the world. And we can do it because we are located where we are. And as far as the Chinese are concerned, we must be ready for 1,000 cuts, like Pakistan has been doing. China has joined that bandwagon. On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you, General Menon. So one, electoral reforms on the double, and of course to be prepared that not only Pakistan, but China and Pakistan together will constantly keep us on the boil. It's been really illuminating. Time now for some questions from our audience. The first one is addressed to General Hasnain. General Hasnain, this is from Commodore Iyengar. How can the negative image created of the government's actions be corrected? You covered some of that, but would you care to elaborate?
Thank you very much. Yes, definitely. In the short time that I had available with me, this is one of the issues which I had addressed quite comprehensively. I did mention that the government of India normally has a lot going at one time. It does manage to get a strategy into place, although it may take some time. I entirely agree with General Menon that when it comes to task forces and things like that, it would be far better to have working hands on task forces rather than over busy bureaucrats who really can't move anything. For example, the recent task force on oxygen which was set up, I don't see any reason why some professionals from the corporate sector, some really great professionals from the corporate sector who have been dealing with the logistics, with the supply chain management, why they could not be inducted into it. Why someone from the armed forces couldn't be inducted into it. A former Director General Ordnance, for example, a former Director General Supplies and Transport, all whose job has been just this, nothing else. So no doubt this is one of the aspects. But to come back to your primary question, the aspect of image, you see, as we've got the empowered groups at the moment, and you did mention in my bio in the beginning that I am a member of one of the empowered groups. Now, this empowered group looks after communication strategy. But so far, the way I have perceived it, we have looked at the aspect of communication strategy primarily from an aspect of information spread within the country about the pandemic, about COVID protocols, about COVID appropriate behavior and things like that, vaccination drive and things like that. It's about time this committee probably took in someone like Ambassador Mukhopadhaya into its ranks, a couple of one or two more very high-profile diplomats, and also therefore went into the whole aspect of diplomacy, because international image management is not an easy thing. Second thing is, I'm not so sure that the INB ministry, with all its different stakeholders within who do this job, and they do it reasonably well, no doubt. But to get a kind of an international campaign going at the highest levels to sensitize the world about India, about its capabilities, about the hit that India may have taken, but its propensity to be able to bounce back, which is what I use, the bounce back strategy, the whole game about bounce back strategy. I'm not sure that this can be handled by the bureaucrats or by government elements. This needs high-class professionals who are outside, who are doing a fantastic job. I always keep recommending institutions like the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, for example, which is something which does a tremendous job. The Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, the Indian Institute of Mass Communication. All these institutions, I'm not sure we have really made effective use of them as far as our international image management is concerned. So that's the way I would look at it.
Thank you. Thank you, General Hasnain. This one for Ambassador Mukhopadhaya from Mr. Parvenu Purohit. Is speedy economic recovery the key to regaining geopolitical importance for India?
Sorry, could you just repeat? Could you just repeat that?
This is from Mr. Purohit. Is speedy economic recovery the key to regaining geopolitical importance for India?
Yes, in a short answer is absolutely yes. But I think there are some elements that I would like to add. Firstly, already because of the impact of the pandemic in the first wave, India was going to be perhaps the last major economic country of consequence that was going to be able to recover. Particularly with the US having got its act together after Biden on vaccinations, we can expect US recovery to be much faster. The UK too, in its second wave, has responded very well. The Europeans are generally, by and large, somewhat in control. Japan has been all right. Korea is fine. East Asia, in general, Southeast Asia has been manageable. So India is the last major economy which is really now buffeted. It's buffeted a second time around. So its recovery will be the slowest. It will take a long term, and unfortunately, its slow recovery will also impact on the global economy to some extent. But I think there is another issue also. I think it's the nature of development that we are pursuing. I think we have depended on a model of growth that has really depended on the top corporates, on the most capacitated parts of our economy to lead the growth, multiply 10 times over if necessary. But we have simply neglected the bottom half of the pyramid. And I think the farm laws are a case in point. Farm laws are a case in the industrial agriculture leading growth. That industrial agriculture was more suited, was designed around the new world where you had a lot of land. In the old world, whether it was Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, or even Africa, where land has, where there has been subsistence agriculture, you need forms of growth that need to tap the parts of the population, 50 to 60% of the population that live off land, water, sun, and the rural countryside. And we have not had strategies that have been based on that. So I think this was an opportunity. The return of the migrants to the villages would have been an opportunity to restructure our economy more along a much stronger agri base, built on processing agri and rural products and building upwards in a kind of value chain, instead of the kind of global value chains that we seem to be seeking. Let's see the EU-India comprehensive partnership. We are talking about connectivity projects in Africa, when in fact, really, what we should be talking about is markets and industries to produce in India. So I think this is the kind of skewed priorities that we have been taking from the past, and the pandemic offered an opportunity to go another way. We have not taken it, and it doesn't seem likely that we will.
So on this, Ambassador, one other thing, if you looked at it last year in terms of how badly, given the total lockdown, how badly the overall national economy was impacted, and then the frenetic, if I may use the word, frenetic rate of growth subsequent to the opening up.
Yeah.
This time, would you not say that the damage in the lockdown may not be as sharp, given that it's been a scheduled lockdown, not across the country, only in certain parts? If I take West Bengal, for example, factories, despite a total lockdown, factories are still running. So do you think that the negative impact on the economy may not be as sharp, and therefore
Yes.
our recovery faster?
You see, unlike, let's say, the depression or even the 2008 financial crisis, the problems of the economy in this case were not structural. So, once the problem of the pandemic was removed, there's every possibility that, the economy would rebound. And actually, that's what we were seeing. The issue is really much more long-term. The issue is whether our economy was on a sustainable path, both environmentally as well as socially, and whether the pandemic could have been an opportunity to change course. I think that is what we have missed. We have missed an opportunity to travel another much more sustainable path. And actually, the rest of the time, that's what we are talking. When we are on the climate change debates, we are actually talking about sustainable economic growth. We are talking about economic growth that is not at the expense of the environment, that in fact is going to cap carbon emissions. So, I think the kind of course that we are taking is at cross purposes with the other global objectives that we ourselves share and have adopted.
Right. Thank you. This one from General Surendranath, and I think General Prakash Menon is best equipped to answer this because he alluded to some of this in his talk as well. What will be the impact of the pandemic and its subsequent waves on the political landscape in India, especially in terms of effecting regime change? And will this also resonate in the region? This is from General Surendranath for General Prakash Menon.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I was a psychologist. But I think the question is very pertinent because what the pandemic has done definitely is about, you can say, weakening the image of the Prime Minister himself, who till now was taking credit personally, never gave it to others, was the authoritative figure who said that we have conquered the pandemic, we are the Vishwa Guru, we are leaders of the world, and so on. And people find those claims very hollow. So I must actually go back to the issue about politicians, that politicians cannot rule purely by oratory. They need to deliver results too. Oratory will go on forever, but without results. And what has happened now is with the pandemic, and the pandemic has affected everybody personally. It is in every home, in the sense that the loss of a loved one and so on. So questions are being asked. Of course, there'll always be counters and there will be narratives put out as to why. I mean, there is one WhatsApp thing saying that why India is actually doing much better than the deaths as far as the population ratio is concerned. So you can do anything with statistics to prove it, and we know it. So the point is, this is going to be a churn in India's politics. That obviously there's going to be, it looks like by the way the trend lines are, that the regional forces in many parts are probably going to gain strength. Whether those regional forces will unite to overcome the might and the popularity of the BJP, only an election will tell. But they will possibly try to do so, but that's 3 years away, and I don't see anything changing before 3 years. So the question for us is, if we want India to change, and that's why I'm emphasizing electoral reform, you cannot change without electing the leaders that can manage it, because India otherwise also is a complex country. And we have, and our political leaders, whatever we might think of it, you know, it's not a monarchy where you can educate one person. You need to educate everybody. You need to educate the populace actually, who will be the ones who will elect. So one of the things which we have neglected, we do unless we reform in a major way our education sector, unless we teach people to question instead of learning by rote, there is no way that the Indian will not be so gullible as to believe any story that is told to him. This is precisely what politicians are doing to the Indian populace, leading them by the nose, because that is all that the Indian populace has been taught in their education. Just listen and believe, not to question. So there are certain fundamental things which we need to address, and this is the pandemic should give us the opportunity of questioning all this. There's nothing which we cannot change. We must believe in that. It will never be sufficient. But let us not forget our strengths. We are a 1.3 billion. We are not a pushover. China cannot come across the Himalayas and capture our territory and expect to actually sustain itself. No country in the world actually can do anything much to us. We are, frankly speaking, territorially quite secure. Where we are insecure is in the insecurity of our populace, and that is the crux of the whole thing. What is the use of all the security if the populace does not feel safe? Not only safe from bad health, but also safe from the fact that they don't know where their next meal or their employment comes from. That's why the economy is very important, and that India can come out of this. And as I agree with you, the impact on the economy will only be, you can say, restrained by our own inability not to use the opportunities that the pandemic has given us. I think we need to understand this fundamentally. If we can exploit it, then even the politicians will gain. Right now, it's all about setting good messages when there are no good messages at this point in time. I get up every day in the morning to hear only bad news. So don't try to tell me that India is doing pretty well. India is doing badly, maybe in terms of in somebody's head, but in terms of its individuals, they feel insecure, they feel unsafe, and that is no security.
Thank you.
So the politicians will have to listen to it.
General Menon, thank you so much. Wonderful response, very elaborate. Just one point of dispute. I think you have a cephalogist in you. This one for you, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, and this is really bringing in, you know, there was initially this conspiracy theory floating about the Wuhan virus being specifically created to cause pandemonium in the world. And now there seems to be some research that it was indeed, an experiment that went awry in the Wuhan lab. So this question from Colonel Siddharth Seth and Mr. Narayan Krishnan is really asking whether it could be biological warfare. The second wave, could it be biological warfare? And how does one put an end to experiments not going awry, for which the world at large has paid a huge price? So two questions from these two gentlemen.
Okay, personally, I really doubt if it was originally conceived as biological warfare, or even if the mutant which has really come out of the spread of the virus is engineered or doctored. And I think the reason for that is that, gain of function research is something that is known. It was something that was actually publicly funded. The US knew that it was risky because it had incidents in its labs. And if I'm also just going by what I'm reading, and if what I read is to be believed, then in fact, the US actually determined it was too dangerous for them. And in some sense, found a partner, outsourced it to China. But it was conceived of as gain of function research, and which they justified. They said that, there is something of value in being able to do that. So I don't really agree that it was, I'm not a scientist to be able to answer that, but based on my intuition, I don't think it may have been that. But certainly it is true that China tried to take immediate advantage of it. And its first immediate advantage was in fact at Galwan. It didn't even wait a few months when it saw that it probed. It was this very probing kind of missions in Ladakh, possibly intended to test our capacities, possibly intended to show us down in our immediate environment as well as the world, to cut us to size, because they thought that we were getting too big for our boots. Possibly even strategic objectives. I mean, I personally feel that perhaps these were significant steps that they were taking to actually cross the Pamirs in some strategic sense and tie up with their objectives with Iran across the Pamirs and the Hindu Kush. Certainly, I mean, one of the immediate outcomes of the pandemic was that China tried to take advantage of this vis-a-vis India. When it realized that the Indian army was more than a match for them there, they actually they realized that they had miscalculated. They settled for some kind of agreement. But the fact is, at the end of it, they are still sitting in a much more advantageous position vis-a-vis us, and they continue to remain a point of pressure. And I think the same way they have used vulnerabilities elsewhere in the world, particularly in the United States.
Thank you, sir. This one for General Hasnain from Raghavendra Pratap Singh. Should armed forces be extensively involved in capabilities enhancement, R&D, and supporting supply chain management, particularly in a crisis situation such as now? And to that, I'll add, should the armed forces have been called in to help civilians much, much more than they have been so far?
Thank you for that question. Yes, and this has been extensively discussed and debated. I know within many circles in Delhi, we've had our discussions of the NDMA with the different think tanks, with FICCI and CII and quarters like that. And the broad consensus which has emerged is that the armed forces have already done a fair amount. Whether this was thought through in a strategic manner, I'm not very sure. This business of putting up these DRDO hospitals all over the place and then manning them by the armed forces medical services has actually brought in a huge commitment there. And of course, the image is going around that these are all done by the DRDO. Actually, it is the army, which is armed forces medical services, which are actually performing the job out there. This has no doubt been a major contribution. But the area where I really think in which the armed forces have not been exploited are two areas. One is the supply chain management of essentials, particularly the oxygen supply. Even the imported oxygen coming in, why is it lying in different areas? Why isn't it flying to the correct cities? Why is it coming to Delhi most of it? Why is it lying in warehouses? Why is equipment which is coming in internationally, why is it coming to warehouses and central warehouses? This is where the armed forces could have come in a very big way to actually streamline this entire thing in a very quick time frame, because they're used to doing this. In the case of the armed forces, of course, our systems are already in place mostly. It's just a question of adaptation. Besides that, the vaccination effort. I can tell you this morning I had a very impassioned discussion with a former very senior general who all of us have served under, and he was livid absolutely. He said the only way that we have to go forward is don't even think of a third wave. The third wave has to be just prevented. We should not be allowed to come at all. And the vaccination should be 100% for the nation in the next couple of months, just a couple of months itself. The only organization which can undertake this on a war footing is this Indian Armed Forces, and coupled with the Central Armed Police Forces. Why not? They are almost equal in number, and they've got a very large workforce of medical professionals also with them. So I do think that one of the major considerations which perhaps has been in the minds of the hierarchy, the leadership everywhere, people who are responsible, is how much of a compromise will that be on India's defense capability up in the high Himalayas, on the western borders, etc.? And I do feel that a lot of people perceive that there is a limit up to which you can allow the armed forces to be employed. And therefore, we should not compromise on this particular issue, particularly the Army Medical Corps. So that's the way to look at it. I think there has to be an optimization up to a level to which we can go, but definitely on the vaccination front, I think the armed forces have to come in. May I answer a question of Admiral Chauhan? Because his question came in, I wrote on it, I will take it live, and therefore the question disappeared. So I must just address that question. The issue is actually a response to my statement that India is a bulwark against the eastward march of political Islam. And I think from that he took a cue and said that in India, Bangladesh and Indonesia, three of the most populous populations of Muslims in the world, if they can get together on a common platform with a common understanding about Islam, Islamic politics, then perhaps nothing can be done from the Pakistani or the radical elements from the Middle East, etc. My simple response to this is an excellent idea. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. Will India ever be allowed an entry? Right from 1969, we saw what happened at Rabat, the OIC meeting at Rabat, in which Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed had gone and represented India. Ambassador Mukhopadhaya would remember that very famous meeting where he was made to sit outside and not really enter into the meeting. Ever since then, the only time that we've had an Indian entry to be allowed to speak there was when our External Affairs Minister, Sushma Swaraj, went to the UAE to speak at the OIC Foreign Ministers meet. Otherwise, India has been a 175 million Muslim population has just gone unrepresented, primarily because the Pakistanis do not. And they always keep threatening about it, and they always keep actually blackmailing the OIC community to make sure that they always state that they will walk out in case there's any permission for India or into the as an entry into OIC. Creating a separate platform, I'm not sure how enthused will be Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, they will permit a thing like this to happen. Whether these two countries will ever want India to come into this, because they will themselves be always declared as pariah within the OIC. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is the second last question, and it goes to Ambassador Mukhopadhaya. This is on elaborating on Russia's role and how much we can depend on them, or is there entente with China now to our detriment? So this is the second last question to Ambassador Mukhopadhaya. Is the China-Russia entente to India's detriment? You're on mute, sir. So your mic is on.
Yeah. No. So is this the question relating to the Quad and Russia, or?
So this is, please bring in all the aspects you want to when addressing this.
Right. So yeah, I actually do see a bit of a Cold War developing. On one side, the US, on the one side, Russia and China, and on the other side, all the countries, the West, Australia, Japan, and India as a kind of new entrant. As far as Russia is concerned, I see that our relations will likely go through a bit of a rocky period. But on the whole, in the long term, I do feel that it will recover. And as far as China is concerned, I think this is going to be a long-term challenge. I don't think we have devised the right responses to China. I think it would take too long and it's an entirely different subject to be able to go to see what kind of response to China would be the right kind of response. For the time being, I think there is no option but to form partnerships. We cannot do this alone, particularly when we have a challenge at our borders. Though ultimately, we should not forget that as a 1.3 billion country, a 1 million strong army, a great democracy, a scientific and technical power, and a nuclear power, in the long run, we have to be a pole in international affairs, not a satellite to anyone else. And there's this question on the economic part that we missed out, and I'd like to answer that because this is a very important question. I think the economic part that we missed out is really the Amul model or the Gujarat model, or sometimes called also the Korean model. And the difference between that model and the present model that we seem to be embarking on is that that model was based on, it did not disrupt ownership. It was based on cooperative ownership, but corporate management. It was based on aggregating the produce of small producers, but scaling that produce up through modern inputs, technologies, management, and markets. And for a country like India, a 1.3 billion population, with 60 to 70% still largely dependent on agriculture, most of it not industrial agriculture, but small-scale agriculture and subsistence agriculture. What we have to do is to make subsistence agriculture and rural industries self-sustaining and provide the right inputs, technical and managerial and technological, to be able to do that. Instead, we are relying on a top 1.2%. Let me just take an example that India's growth at its highest was almost about 10%, but that 10% GDP. But that 10% was being created by at the most 200 million, the upper 200 million section of the population. Leave out the young and the old, and essentially 500 million people, most of your agriculture was going between 0 to 2%. Imagine if you just added 1% growth at the bottom of the pyramid, at the subsistence level. The power that you would unleash would be much more than any number of nuclear bombs that you would like. And somehow we have not focused on that.
Thank you so much, Gautam. I think that's been a very, very elaborate and enlightening answer.
Yeah.
We have tons of questions pending from the audience. Regrettably, paucity of time will not permit us to take them all. This is the absolute last question from AVM Pranay Sinha for General Menon. What administrative reforms would you suggest in brief? He'd like an elaboration. You alluded to administrative reforms. So, would you suggest a few top ones to your mind? Sir, you're on mute.
Okay. So I'm saying that the first level at which, unless you change that, nothing else will change, is my fundamental, which is about changing the quality of political leadership we elect. And I believe that can only be done through electoral reforms, because most of the problems connected with the administration, it is about politicization of the administration itself. And that I don't have to say anything more except to quote that for the last more than 10 years, the Supreme Court has given certain orders to the states and the center. They're not being obeyed about how the police is to be act and so on. So the point is, I'm talking about that the first level. Second thing is, we need to see which is the better system to get good people with good ideas to the right place at the right time. This is the problem. Okay. So while we have a system by which a guy who actually writes an exam today and is then propelled upwards automatically, despite his performance, to become the secretary of the government, we need to re-examine it. And that's why I spoke about that model of administration, which is 1950 model, may not be. We have good people in India. We not only we don't have them in government, the government does not use the private sector because most of our good people are in the private sector. I mean, this is nothing to do with just defense. It is across governance. So the question really is, will the government, in terms of its governance and administration, get off its high horse, allow others into the turf which they have captured because they have control and they can actually do what they want? And I'm afraid that they have lost our trust. So the point is, I can't just give you a simple answer, but I'm just talking about, it's all about people. It's not about procedures, what we need to, it's about getting people, correct place, get the right guy. That is what, in any sphere, that's the central problem of India. We have the people, we don't have them in the right place. That's the administrative problem. So we need to sort that out. Thank you.
Square peg in a round hole. So may I request General Shankar on behalf of Team CASA to sum up the discussion that we have had this evening. General Shankar, please.
Thanks a lot, Manoj. And at the outset, let me thank General Hasnain, General Prakash Menon Both of them have been my gurus at some point of time, and even continue to be now also. I also thank Ambassador Mukhopadhaya for his wonderful intervention. And one important thing which he said, India should aim to be the third pole or a pole. Actually, today I wrote an article called The Third Pole. And India's, in fact, I titled it The Collapsing Third Pole. But then, let me put things in perspective and sum up what each of you have said. Or I won't say each of you, I'll put it in a whole this thing. Let's look at the state of the virus. If you take the past viruses and plagues and everything, they've lasted years. This is only the second year. We just finished 1 year we are just 1.5 years into this virus. There's a long way to go, right? And it's a very fluid state, and things are not certain, and this is not the end of the road. Now, when you look at India's status today, it is all death and destruction all around. There's no doubt about it. But look at it, say 2 months, 3 months ahead of, already the cases have started falling. The deaths will stabilize and we will get over it. Our vaccination will take off. Already we've vaccinated 17 crore people, and it can only increase in a couple of months, right? Let's say it doubles. You have 34 crores vaccinated, and whatever the virus has affected, it is about 5 to 10 times the official figure, right? Which means a whole lot of population are already infected or vaccinated. That means you're moving faster to herd immunity, which is the only way out of any virus. So you might be looking at something different after a couple of months. So let's not get into that. But then there are a lot of issues, and that I'll come to. But let me talk a little about the third pole, the third pole business and what is going for us. A lot of us have spoken about our international image and this and that and all that. I think this entire business of the virus and the geopolitics and India, whether it's on India or in India, is a matter of semantics. But what are the long-term indicators? Right. I'll read it out. I'll read this excerpt out because that will be the shortest way of doing it. I've written 7 factors dictate the fact that India can continue to rise. First, the rest of the world is also down and really not far ahead. Most of us are in the same leaky boat. Let's not forget that. It's when you look at yourself, you find it difficult, but they are also not that far ahead. Second, China's aggressive rise has instilled an all-pervasive dread that it has to be reined in. This is international in thinking. India is the only alternative to China in scale and strength. India knows how to handle China better than most. That's a fact. Containing China without a progressive India is well nigh impossible. The world needs India to succeed. So the world will support us, and that's something which is playing out. Third, China might seem to be running ahead of the pack. That's the general thinking. I have a different view, right? It still runs the risk of falling victim to this virus and its mutants. It is not vaccinated. It is just ring-fenced itself. And one day this either we are vaccinated or the virus will catch us. That's for certain, right? And their vaccines are not functioning. And that's proven in Seychelles, that's proven in UAE, and that's proven in Brazil. So let's not put China that far ahead of the race. In the next 3 to 4 years, there is going to be an aging population. And that's a bomb which everyone knows, but somehow it's missing the people are missing the boat. So there are limits to its rise, right? Fourth, India has a indispensable frontline location in the current geostrategic construct. This is something which was brought out, right? And that you cannot, and compared to this geostrategic frontline status of India, what Pakistan has is peanuts. Okay, fifth, India is a civilizational power coming out of the dark days of colonial subjugation. Its civilizational values, unless diluted, can restitute it to its original form. So the rider is can we use our civilizational values and syncretic religion and syncretic culture to take us forward or dilute it? That's a challenge to us. Sixth, no one can keep a young nation of 1.3 billion people down except itself. So again, the onus is on us. Seventh, the world knows what to expect from India despite all its pitfalls. Everyone knows what India is and what a messy democracy we are. There is a trust and reliability factor in India which was not there in China. And the world has learned from China the lack of trust and reliability on China. They burned their fingers. They need us to succeed. So that is where we are. But well, let's look at it a little differently. So this is the external image. Let's not get too cowed down by the current, images which are going, New York Times and this and that. We ourselves are shown even more grotesque images than what it is and what the perceptions are. But what are our challenges? And those challenges, General Prakash Menon has actually put a spotlight on them, and so have other speakers. And those are internal issues, right? In all this, if you see, we've lost political capital. We've lost political capital internally. We've lost political capital externally. And unless we have that internal strength, we can't do well externally. That's the example of China. China, because of its internal strength, is able to do well externally, whereas USA, because of its lack of internal strength, is not projecting itself the way its potential is there. Things might change. And so will it in our case also. But then we have larger questions than most. And that this virus has brutally exposed. What is it? We spoke of leadership. Problems galore. State was a center was a center, the bureaucratic leadership was a political leadership, the political leadership not in sync with the military leadership. We have huge issues. Let's not look at small issues like, can we put the army for sorting out the virus and all? I'm looking at the larger issue of India's rise, right? We need that equation, which is absolutely in flux. Then the economics, which again was brought out by Ambassador Mukhopadhaya. We've already gone through last year's hit on our economy, where we went down to 14 to 20% in our GDP, right? With the virus and the war-torn economy of Eastern Ladakh. It's a war-torn economy. Again, you've been hit broadside by the second wave, for which you are looking at the other side and it's got enhanced. The costs are enhanced, and so it's going to be a compound effect. Can we recover from this? Is a huge question, especially our unorganized sector and the small sector, which actually are the sheet anchor of our economy, especially that Amul model, which was very aptly brought out. The next point which we have discussed is governance, our governance model or administration model. Unless we get the fundamental governance right, unless we get our fundamental leadership right, there is an issue. It is not as if we don't have. We have. I live in a state where it's managing everything well. We've been to polls, we've been to everything, but oxygen is not run out. Remdesivir is available to a guy for, who can stand in a line for 4 hours and take it. But at the end of 4 hours, he gets his remdesivir, which is not available in very many places, and especially in our capital. That's where our image projection has gone wrong. Look at Orissa, which is a state which doesn't have anything. We've heard of Kalahandi starvation deaths. If you look at it and you look at the numbers, there are hardly their deaths every day are in double figures even now. It is not as if India is fully collapsed. There are some parts of India which are in despair, and that is fundamentally in the north, right? And of course, then there's this international image. International image will change. It might persist. Everyone knows our problems, but at the same time, things will change. And that's the nature of India. We have to have faith in ourselves, right? The people of India will push India up. That's my firm conviction. But the biggest question in my mind, and I suppose in everyone's mind today, is our leadership up to it? And I think all these points have been brought out. And at the end, I'd like to say, it is just today that I've written an article on called The Collapsing of the Third Pole. And a few days back, I wrote an article called Governance of the by the Unelected. Please read both of them. And if you heard what these gentlemen have said, these wise people who have said, I think everything comes into focus. With this, thanks a lot. I'd like to hand over the stage to General Gautam Murthy. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, Manoj, you wanted to say something?
Sorry, I wanted to just add one, big thank you to General Shankar for his summation, and which he wonderfully captured what everyone had said. And just one sobering thought I want to end on from Murakami before I hand it over to you. Murakami said, and this I think is very relevant to us now, and once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain, when you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in. On that sobering note, may I hand over the mic to our founder, chairman, General Murthy.
Thank you very much, Manoj. All that remains for me is to thank our esteemed panelists, General Prakash Menon, General Hasnain, and Mr. Gautam Mukhopadhaya for this most marvelous webinar. I think it was a no holds barred webinar. Everybody spoke their heart, they spoke their mind, and we've received some excellent questions from the audience, which were also tackled wonderfully by the panelists. I thank all of you, the audience, the participants. We've had about 82 of us listening in. It was wonderful, and thank you, Manoj, for moderating it. Thank you, Mahadevan, Irfan, Barnali, and the technical team. And above all, thank you, General Shankar, for a wonderful summing up. And the Murakami quote that Manoj mentioned reminds me of that wonderful painting of the Sea of Galilee by Rembrandt, where Lord Jesus Christ takes the ship to safety. So let us pray and hope that Lord Jesus Christ and all the gods that we worship in takes the ship of India and the ship of planet Earth to safety. Thank you very much. Good night and Jai Hind.
Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. Jai Hind.